From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A federal judge in Georgia rules against a Stacey Abrams-aligned lawsuit claiming voter suppression as listeners respond on congressional stock trades and the Supreme Court's legitimacy. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Stacey Abrams became a national figure in 2018 after losing the Georgia gubernatorial election to Governor Brian Kemp, and the reason was that she refused to concede that loss. Shortly after that election, a group aligned with Abrams called Fair Fight Action filed a lawsuit in Georgia in federal court alleging all sorts of constitutional violations in its voting process. Some of those claims were dismissed at earlier stages. We're now 4 years into this litigation, but after a 21-day trial and more than 50 witnesses, a federal judge last week ruled in favor of the state on all of the remaining counts. Kim, can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on here and what the importance of this is?
Sure. Well, remember, this is over the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial race. And Stacey Abrams, as late as 2019, was insisting that even though she lost officially in that race, that she had actually won. And when there became comparisons to Donald Trump also claiming he had won, she sought to clarify her point. And she claimed that her issue was access to the election, that it was flawed, that the system in Georgia had put in place rules that permits citizens to be denied access. And her quote here was, "That is very different than someone claiming a fraudulent outcome." Well, now we have this case that was brought soon after the 2018 election by an organization tied to Ms. Abrams called Fair Fight Action. And this litigation has gone on a long time. It finally got its final hearing in front of Judge Steve Jones, who I would note was appointed by Barack Obama. And he looked at the complaints, a number of which had been dismissed earlier as not having any merit. But those that did survive were around Georgia's supposed mismanagement of voter registration lists, including a program called an exact match policy, in which Georgia's practice of cross-checking new voter registrations with other information from other databases was under scrutiny. And he basically said no, that there was no evidence through any of this that the burden on voters was too high. It did not deny access. We can go through the details of why that was. But in essence, the judge essentially said that her claims that she had won because people were denied access to the ballot simply didn't stand up under scrutiny.
And some of this to me looks like just de minimis burdens on people. You have to have some sort of rules for a voting process, and there are going to be some instances where those rules are not followed. And so the rule may be as simple as you have to go to the right precinct, or you have to send your mail-in ballot to the right address. And you can't take away every de minimis burden on voters. So to dig into this exact match policy, essentially what happens is when a voter registers in Georgia, that information gets cross-checked, including with the database on driver's licenses. And so here's the example that the judge gives. If Jonathan William Smith registers to vote as Billy Smith, then that voter record is flagged as needing identification. But what's interesting about this is that the voter who's flagged gets a letter advising them of the mismatch, but that person can also go to the polls and vote just like anybody else. Georgia already has a voter ID law, and so the person who's flagged as having an ID mismatch in the voter rolls can show up at the polls and hand over an ID like anybody else and cast the ballot. And so the judge's explanation here is that the burden on voters is pretty low from this policy, and that the state has a rational, compelling interest in making sure that the people who register are actually real Georgia voters who match the people in the driver's license list or the Social Security list or whatever database they're using to verify these IDs. And so, Monet, the question that I often have for people who are making these voter suppression claims is, what kind of a burden is de minimis? And the other thing that I would point to is there was a lawsuit last year, also in Georgia, about whether it is unconstitutional for voters who vote by mail to have to put their own stamp on the ballot. And this is an actual federal court ruling by the circuit court there, the appeals court. We hold that the fact that absentee voters in Georgia who decide to vote by mail must pay their own postage is not a tax or an unconstitutional fee on voting. And Monet, I find that a lot of the arguments about voter suppression gets into these kinds of things that look to me like pretty low, reasonable burdens on anybody who is participating in any sort of government process to check voters and get them to the polls.
Right. I think that from what I've seen of the ruling, Judge Steve Jones, who handed it down, seems to have done a very, very good job and a very careful job considering each claim on a case-by-case basis about what might constitute voter suppression, and clearly was not ideologically motivated. As I believe you mentioned, Steve Jones is an Obama appointee, clearly was not ideologically motivated and gave careful attention to some of these claims, and frankly, maybe even a little bit more consideration than they were due, given how small some of these suggested burdens really were when you break down how these registration and voting regulations play out. So I think you were right to highlight the question of we do have a compelling state interest in making sure that there's no fraud in the elections process. And so there are going to have to be some requirements of voters. And it's up to the judge to determine what is and is not sort of a de minimis sort of burden. And in all of these cases, they were ruled, I think, correctly to be de minimis. But I think there is a secondary consideration, which is that even if the regulations do impose some kind of burden on voters, is that burden actually going to have any kind of disparate impact on one group of voters or another? Because even if that wasn't part of the legal argument that Stacey Abrams was making, I believe they tried to make a more general argument and say that voters were being suppressed as a whole. That certainly is at the center of the political argument that they've been making publicly. The idea that Georgia's voter laws were created specifically for the purpose of suppressing Black turnout. And I think if you look at these regulations, it's very difficult to see how any of them could disproportionately impact Blacks compared with other groups. I don't believe that they found very much evidence that that was in fact the case. And as we've seen in the aftermath of both the 2018 and 2020 elections, Black turnout actually has increased quite a lot. And that was one of the reasons why Stacey Abrams was able to get as close as she did to taking the governorship in a red state. And so I think that this ruling should go a long way to both justify the idea that states do have some ability to pass reasonable restrictions on how a person can register and cast their vote, but then also dispelling the narrative that there's this nefarious campaign to suppress the Black vote.
But Stacey Abrams is now in a bit of a political pickle because she's running again for the governor's office in November, a grudge match against Governor Brian Kemp. And people know her primarily for this fact that she claimed that the election was stolen from her in 2018. And let's listen to her. This is Abrams speaking in 2019.
I know you've heard from a lot of folks, and I think some of you know what I'm going to say. We had this little election back in 2018, and despite the final tally and the inauguration and the situation we find ourselves in, I do have one very affirmative statement to make. We won.
Kim, to my ear, that sounds a little bit Trumpian, I might say. And so, as you mentioned earlier, she has been trying to distinguish herself and say what I've been arguing is nothing like what President Trump is arguing. And here's Abrams at a forum held by the 19th News in September.
The issues that I raised in 2018 were not grounded in making me the governor. Not a single lawsuit filed would have reversed or changed the outcome of the election. My point was that the access to the election was flawed, and I refused to concede a system that permits citizens to be denied access. That is very different than someone claiming fraudulent outcome. And we have to, words matter. Access, can you get there? Outcome, do you get what you want? I'm proof you don't get what you want.
Kim, I guess I take the point that Abrams is making that she was not trying to reverse the 2018 election. Her supporters did not go and storm the governor's mansion or anything like that. But how convincing do you find her argument that her claims are different from President Trump's claims?
Well, first of all, they're not different because you have to look at her initial statement, that first clip we listened to, in which she said, we won. That is essentially claiming that the outcome was incorrect, was fraudulent, that something happened in the system that denied the rightful person their place at the top of the ticket and in the governor's mansion. So she can now try to modulate it all she wants, but that was where she began. And she only began to try to come up with these distinctions after Democrats became so obsessed with pointing out that Trump's fraudulent claims and, calling him an election denier, etc. She didn't want to be put into that category. But when I back up, I look at it this way. All through political history, this country has had very vigorous fights over election rules, okay, about access to the ballot, what kind of burdens will be imposed, how can you have the most people coming while also maintaining that state interest in voting integrity, etc. And to my mind, the bright line here is when you start claiming after the fact that someone who was certified didn't actually win. All right. Now, and I talk about this too, Republicans. It's an interesting case in point, given the recent election. Were there a lot of shenanigans that had to do with voter access going into the 2020 presidential election? Absolutely. We wrote about a lot of them. Democrats filed lawsuit after lawsuit to try to change the rules in a way that advantaged their voters. And we've had examples of that. For instance, drop boxes in Texas that were only positioned in very highly blue areas to kind of make it easier for those people to vote versus other people to vote. But they were all done by officials or they were imposed by courts. They were all kind of legal, just like Georgia's voting laws are legal, as was again reconfirmed by this federal judge this week. So, yes, let's all have those fights. Yes, let's talk about it. And yes, let's have the parties be actively engaged in these discussions and policy debates about voting rules. But when you go over the line and you then, again, after the fact, say that the rules that were in place were so egregiously decided as to call into the validity the results of an election, that's when you end up in the category where Trump is and where Stacey Abrams began, even if she's now trying to claim she isn't there now.
And both of these things, I think it's notable, happened in Georgia, which makes it an interesting case study. President Trump said there was all sorts of fraud in Georgia that has not been detected despite the counting of the 2020 ballots 3 times and also an audit of absentee ballot signatures in Cobb County. Stacey Abrams said there was wild voter suppression, which has not been proved in court. And the thing about court is they demand evidence. And so Trump's lawsuits in Georgia were not successful. Abrams's lawsuits in Georgia were not successful. And you have a guy like Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, who has vociferously opposed both of these polar ideas that the elections in Georgia can't be trusted either because of some massive fraud or because of some massive voter suppression. And so I don't expect him to get any apologies from either of them. But Monet, we'll give you the last word on this topic. It seems to me that Georgia and Raffensperger and Brian Kemp are owed 2 apologies now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the two of them have done a great job, as you said, kind of rejecting both narratives from Stacey Abrams and from Donald Trump about the voting irregularities in their state. I think it isn't a coincidence that Georgia became the flashpoint for this debate because, on the one hand, it is a state where, you have quite a lot of people moving in. You have the Black population increasing, and both of these constituencies, the movers in and Blacks in general, and there's a lot of overlap between those two, tend to lean a little bit more Democratic than the traditional population of the state. And so the election margins have been tightening. I think in 2018, a lot of Democrats really thought it was their chance to finally take back the governor's mansion. And so when they didn't, it really caught on when Stacey Abrams said, hey, we were this close, and the only reason we weren't able to do it was because of foul play. And then similarly in 2020, I think a lot of Republicans were shocked when Joe Biden was able to win that state, the first Democrat to win it since the 1990s. And so similarly, when Trump said, the Democrats were playing against the rules, a lot of people really thought that that made a lot of sense too. And so as the country has polarized and as the gap has shrunk between the parties in some of these states, it's not surprising that you see a little bit more controversy about whether there's fair voting taking place.